Welcome back, Canisius High School community. It's Andy Deyell, Vice President for Institutional Advancement, back with another episode of Conversations with Canisius, where we check in with alum all over the United States and the world, really, and see what they've been up to since their time at 1180 Delaware here in Buffalo. Today, I am joined by Holodnak, who is the founder and CEO of Occam Global, an executive recruiting firm in New York City, and Bill is a class of 1964. Bill, how are you?
I'm good. Great.
Very good. Well, let's jump right in here. Take us back to your time at Canisius High School. Give us a little bit of an insight into what it was like to be at Canisius, and then take us after Canisius through your college and graduate school experiences. And if you can, briefly get us up to where you are today.
So you want the whole rogue story? Is that the idea? Yeah. Well, I was at a Catholic grade school in Hamburg, New York, which is, as you know, in the South Towns area. And my parents wanted the best for me, and they felt Canisius was that. I interviewed with Father Dolan, who was the, I think it was the, do you have a president? Who is the reigning, what's the dominant office?
Father David Ciantamino is the president.
Yeah, well, the Father Dolan, I can't remember his first name, but he was an awfully nice person. Anyhow, I had an interview with him. He believed that I had virtues that could be enhanced by Canisius High School, and so I was fortunate enough to get in. I did not live in the city, so I commuted every day from Hamburg to Buffalo and back. So I always regret that I didn't have more time for extracurriculars, but an arduous commute got in the way there. I pretty much loved the curriculum and the teachers, and I may have told you this in our previous conversation. At the end of my first year, I did well enough to be, do you still have the honors programs, the science and the Greek honors programs?
Yeah.
Well, the romantic side of me wanted the Greek honors, but as you may remember, you probably don't, but if you consult history books, you'll know the Sputnik went up around that time, and there was a great sense of the need for more scientifically trained people. The fact that I was temperamentally not suited towards science didn't get in my way of making that judgment. I always regret never having learned Greek, but I benefited from the 4 years of Latin. I think, and I insisted that both my children study Latin, even though they didn't go to Jesuit schools. I think Latin structures the way you think and the way you speak and the way you write in profound ways, especially if you get introduced to it at the time. So memorable teachers, Mr. Mayer in geometry, Mr. Meehan in English. Those are names that I remember. Father Pfeiffer taught me Latin in my first year, and he was cross-eyed. And when I or other people would get out of line, he'd point, "You get out," and three of us would stand up. You know, so there were some advantages in his anatomical shortcomings. And then there was who was he? Anyhow, a chemistry teacher who was a health food addict way ahead of his time. Colorful personalities, brilliant men, and generous teachers. So I don't know what else I could say, but push me if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So as you moved on from Canisius High School, tell us a little bit about your undergraduate and graduate experiences, because they're both very interesting.
Well, I went to Canisius College, which was not as stimulating an experience as Canisius High School. And it wasn't stimulating because it was kind of more the same down the block, but not as intense. The people I went to school with, or in my class at Canisius High School, were among the smartest people that I ever met in any context. And it wasn't as intense an experience or as rich an experience. The two aren't equivalent terms, but I think, you know, anyone 17, 18 years old has probably got to get away from home. So maybe I'm just offering you some nostalgia for not having left my home turf sooner. I might have come back to Buffalo had I not gotten such a heavy dose of it on the front end.
Sure, sure.
And so I gave Canisius College a hard time, but I also had great teachers there. And I wound up studying, not science, because I had purged myself of that, but studying history, which is still a love. And I wound up in a PhD program at Johns Hopkins, which is a wonderful school, a great program. For those of you who don't know, I think that Johns Hopkins is the oldest graduate school of the arts and sciences in the country, and it was modeled on the German system of graduate education, which meant that in order to get your doctorate, you had to produce an original publishable piece of research, not just something that dissatisfied departmental requirements. And Johns Hopkins is also known for having Frederick Jackson Turner be one of the first history academics there, one of the most famous. And he's responsible for the frontier thesis, which essentially describes American culture as being defined by the existence of a frontier. And there's an overreaching, restless, adventurous quality embedded in the notion of there always being a frontier, there always being something different. Anyhow, Frederick Jackson Turner had long gone by the time I got there, but it was a great program. But in all life, you find if you're at all astute, you learn along the way. One of my idols is a musician by the name of Thelonious Monk, who has a tune, Blue Monk, which has a lyric that goes, life is a school unless you're a fool. So life has, Canisius High School was certainly a training ground and an educational experience, as was Canisius College, but you learn from life as well, and you learn in terms of what you do and how you react to it. And sometimes you make the right choices, and sometimes you make not the right choices or the wrong choices. In the case of graduate school, as much as I loved history, I was not a serious scholar, and I concluded that. I couldn't sit in a stationary position for 14 hours a day, which is what I did for 2 years, reading Latin, Greek, French, and German sources. No Greek, sorry. I was taking credit for Greek, and I had missed that opportunity at Canisius High School. But Latin, German, and French sources mostly. And it was a very austere discipline. In many ways, I studied medieval history. In many ways, medieval history was a legacy or an outcropping of my own desire to understand the church, because in the Middle Ages, the church dominated Western Europe, and in thought and in other ways. Yeah, it was a very interesting experience intellectually. I read a lot, I learned a lot. I learned about myself, that I wasn't a scholar. Left with my master's degree and all of my coursework complete. I had been in Buffalo for 20 years. I'd been in Baltimore for 2, and then I went to Boston, which is where I spent the next 40 years. When I went to Boston, I did a series of odd jobs. This was more about finding myself. Learning about who you are and what you know and what you don't know, and trying to find a way in the world. And that was a turbulent time as well, much like the one we find ourselves in now, where it was a youth culture and everything was questioned, and there was a rebellion against the conformism of the 50s, only to be substituted by a conformism in the counterculture, but we didn't look at it that way. I was part of the baby boom and that youth culture. I did not go to Woodstock because I always preferred jazz to rock and roll. One of the reasons to not go to Woodstock. Anyhow, I did a lot of odd jobs. I went to Europe. I had studied European history, but had never lived in Europe. I could never afford to travel. And so I did that. And I lived for a year all around, mostly for the last 6 months in Paris, which was the center of medieval culture in many ways. So I got to really imbibe in a physical sense that which I had been investigating mentally. And I came back, and then I got the best job of perhaps my life. I wound up running 3 movie theaters in Boston that showed older American, European, and Asian films. And I developed it was the age of film, you may remember. And there were great directors in Europe and in Asia, and the great directors of Hollywood were fully recognized. Yeah, I became something of a scholar of cinema. I wound up teaching at BU and running these movie theaters. And then one day I met my wife. I was teaching a film class. She didn't pay much attention, but it all worked out. And once I got married, the French director, Jean-Luc Godard, has a great saying: men love women and women love money. So my wife liked me well enough, but she thought I ought to have a better paying job. And she was, of course, right. So I went to business school, the famous restart button. I had there were no commercial people in my family. I never even thought about a business career. That wasn't allowed in the 60s. You thought about doing, religious, spiritual, political kinds of things, not commercial kinds of things. Anyhow, realism intervened, and I reached a compromise with my wife such that I kept the theater job and went to business school full time. After business school, I had decided I should do something in the financial arena. That was the age when I came out, when interest rates were at 20%. There was the Arab oil embargo, and finance was the ruling discipline of the day. Plus, I had wallowed in the liberal arts. I thought I should do something more numerical. So I wound up going into public accounting, an unlikely profession for somebody like myself, but again, a learning experience. I look back at Canisius, and I think that I learned how to speak, I learned how to write, and I learned how to analyze. I had good training on both sides, and even though I had never had an accounting course, I wound up passing the CPA exam. I would like to think in large measure because of divine intervention and Mr. Mayer's geometry course. Much like my experience with formal academic work, I discovered that doing auditing work was not to my liking. And I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't do that. And so I wound up going to an employment agency that kept getting me job offers or getting me interviews that resulted in job offers that were even more punitive than the auditing that I was doing. So I don't think persisting with that line of inquiry was going to go anywhere. But the guy who ran the employment agency liked me and said, "Why don't you try this business?" And so, as dumb as I was about the world and about careers, I at least realized that degree of ignorance. And so I decided to take the job in the employment agency, even though, I had a couple of graduate degrees, and I was working for Price Waterhouse, one of the largest accounting firms in the world. And I would go into this quasi-legitimate profession of recruiting because it felt good instinctively, and I thought I would learn about the world, and so I did. And that was the beginning of my career. I originally replaced accountants and financial analysts and controllers. And then I decided, and I got quite good at it, and it became much more lucrative than accounting. And, but I did like the volume work, so I decided to get into the higher level of recruiting. And I wound up getting hired by a man who had a boutique that focused on the venture capital world. And I knew relatively little about the venture capital world, although it was a very strong industry in Boston. As you might know, the first venture capital firms in the country were started there. General Dorio, who was faculty at Harvard Business School, started one of the first venture firms. And it was a rich culture, and it was a industry or a set of financial institutions that funded growth. This is where digital equipment came from, and Wang Computer and Cullinane Software. And it was the first age of information technology. And all these companies got their start not in the bosom of big companies, but by people who wanted to leave big companies and go out on their own and do something that hadn't been done before, fluid and flexible environment that rewarded entrepreneurship. So I wound up loving the investors and loving the entrepreneurs I worked with. And then one day, in one of the more fortunate episodes in my life, and what did Virgil say? Fortune favors the bold. That was my fourth year of Latin. I don't recall the Latin phrase, but I do recall Virgil's wisdom. So I decided I'd be bold, and I began to look for a job. And then I met one of the more fortunate, back to that word, episodes in my life. I met Ned Johnson, who is a Boston Brahmin and son of the founder of a company called Fidelity Investments, which was a very large asset manager. It was one of the first companies to sell and distribute mutual funds over the phone and through the mails. And it benefited from being at the growth, a wave of growth in retail investors who responded very well to being catered to in the highly honorable and technologically efficient way that Fidelity did. Anyhow, Ned was a very, very, and he still is, I didn't mean to put him in the past tense, he's no longer running the firm, but when he ran it, he always ran it with a great deal of imagination, and he always wanted to do things that were different. So he wanted to start a search firm. So I met him, and he hired me to do that. And so my bargain with the devil was I would do all of his search work, all of his recruiting, and then he would fund a business that I could run, build and run. That firm I ran for 25 years. It wound up having 3 offices in Asia, 3 in this country and 1 in Europe. We recruited globally for all the new growth industries, semiconductors, the internet, electronic commerce, which I guess is a species is enabled by the internet, and life sciences. And I met the life sciences there, which changed my life. I loved venture capitalists and entrepreneurs, but the biologists and the chemists that I met were captivating to me. I liked the way they thought, and I liked their mission, and so that became a sub-expertise for me. And when I transitioned out of Fidelity, I retired after 25 years. I retired for 3 weeks, and my wife said it would be a better idea for me to go back to work. We were in the process of relocating to New York, where I live now, and we have 2 grown children there. One of those grown children is my business partner. So I went back to work with my son, who was just getting out of business school. And so now we have about 10 people in the East Coast and the West Coast, and we recruit for mostly life science companies in Europe, Asia, and the US. We recruit senior people in the scientific disciplines and also the commercial disciplines. I've talked nonstop here, Andy.
No, it's great.
I'm really sorry. So you should tell me to slow down, stop, or change direction if I've gone astray,
No, absolutely not. I mean, the reason I wanted to interview you is just, having known your story and gotten to know it, it's a fascinating one. And I think it's just, part serendipity, part hard work, right? And a little dash of intellectual cognitive horsepower behind it. And I just thought it'd be a great story for not only for our alums, but, for our current students as well, which is a good segue to my next question. As you've talked a little bit about how Canisius has impacted you, through your answer, which was great. But if you were to give some advice to young people today, either current students or kids that are just out of school and they're just starting to make their way into the world, what are 1 or 2 things you would remind people of?
Well, empiricism is really important, and there's also a bit of scholastic wisdom that I would pass on. Anybody who's Catholic or goes to Catholic institutions, certainly Jesuit institutions, winds up encountering Thomas Aquinas sooner or later. And Thomas Aquinas, I forget where I read this, it was in one of the philosophy courses that I invariably took back in the 60s, that in order to, in his parlance, in order to, save your immortal soul, you must go against your natural bent. You must do things that you don't like. And I read that not as a recipe for joylessness in life, but rather kind of going at it, whether it's learning geometry or learning Latin, or whether it's going into public accounting when you had no possible interest in it because I thought in that case it would give me good discipline. Fighting your way, going against your nature, what's easy, is not in any masochistic sense, but just pushing yourself, taking Latin, taking calculus, doing stuff that's hard or different, because you really never know. You never know where life is going to lead you. And if you have fundamental discipline, and if you have the character to kind of go against your own natural bent, sometimes great things happen. So, the way I look at it, unless I exhausted myself going against my natural bent by trying to become a scholar, I would never know how to put ideas and culture in proper context for myself, right? So rather than being an academic, I got all the benefit of that reading and that understanding, that awareness of history that I would never have had otherwise. Unless I pushed myself in that direction, I wouldn't have had the muscularity to kind of say, oh, I did that at a significant level, even though I didn't fulfill it. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I went in a different direction. And I taught myself film, and I didn't want to be a filmmaker, but I learned and I met my wife because of it, because she was a bad film student, as you may recall from the earlier episode. I've never met my wife if I hadn't gone to the movie theater. I would never have, and when I went into public accounting, I went against my natural bent because I knew I wasn't an accountant, but I felt that accounting was I felt two things. I felt accounting was the language of business, which it is in many ways. Because if you know what assets and liabilities and revenues and expenses are, it gives you a grounding in any business discussion. But I also wanted to prove to myself that I could do something technical, right? Because I had done this other stuff, reading and writing, which is all great, right? But I did that. And if I'd never done that, I would never maybe wound up recruiting other accountants. And if I had never recruited other accountants and gotten tired of it, I would never have gotten the other job and took a chance to do that. And it just seems to me that if you focus on fundamentals, which Jesuit education forces you to do, right? Because I came out of Canisius, as I said earlier, with, words and music, words and numbers, right? I felt that the training I got at Canisius High School could make me think through anything.
Right.
I passed the CPA exam without ever having an accounting course. Now, I couldn't have done that if I didn't have fundamental discipline and a fundamental understanding of how numbers and words work and how they work separately. So, I don't know. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Going against your natural bent is one of the hardest things to do. But, a lot of times I believe that, a lot of the greatest things we achieve come through the most strain. And, and so it makes perfect sense to me. It's what I sort of admire. It's sort of what I work with my kids on as well, to lean into the discomfort sometimes, or the counterintuitive parts of life. It's a little hard for a 9 and a 12-year-old, but and I think a lot of it is also gained through wisdom and trying. And in the moment, it's very hard, but it usually after the fact, it makes perfect sense. And so we have time for, I have time for one more question, and it's really about the future. You've talked to us about sort of your story in the past. What do you have planned for 2021? What does Occam Global, what does Bill Holodnak have in store in the future?
Well, I've done this work now for 35 years. This might be interesting for you if we've got time.
Sure.
So I'm a total anomaly in the recruiting business. Most people go into it and stay at a low level. If they come into it at a higher level, they usually take a very focused industry perspective so that they get to know everybody in a niche and they move people around. I was fortunate enough to recruit financial people, and I learned the venture capital and technology world, then I learned the life sciences world. And and I've always been a generalist. One of the reasons I love, I have depth in certain areas, but one of the reasons I love recruiting is that I always talk to people who are more intelligent than I am. So I get from them. It's a very unfair trade that I'm totally joyous to exploit. And then I get to learn new industries. I mean, I recruited a head of venture capital for the Gates Foundation. I recruited a head of a $4 billion public government software company. I've recruited, when I was at Fidelity, I recruited all sorts of investors on the debt and the equity side of the ledger. I've recruited currency traders. I've recruited maybe I used this line on you last time, but I refer to myself as being like Noah, except he recruited 2 of everything. You know, I've only done 1, but I've recruited very broadly. So I look at recruiting as a structural discipline. So it feeds my social Jones, meaning I love meeting new people and engaging new people. I'm a naturally social person. It also feeds my intellectual curiosity by virtue of absorbing and reacting to their experience, and then seeing these people in different industries. You know, so we take on very challenging assignments. And as I told you earlier, a lot of our work is done for equity. So we're an anomalous recruiting firm. We're kind of investors as well as recruiters. And rather than do balance sheet and income statement or market analysis, we learn industries and industry groups, executive groups, subsets of humanity, and we find the best and we make matches. And by enhancing organizations, we create value. And then that value is compounded in the value of the stock of the companies that are successful because of our intervention. We're with next month, a company of ours called Recursion in Salt Lake City, which conjoins artificial intelligence and machine learning and drug discovery to make drug discovery more efficient. This is a company that when we met them, there were 25 people. There are now 200 people. They have $1 billion market valuation, and they're going to go public at $3 billion. And we've recruited lots of people for them that have made a difference on their board and in their executive team, but we've also done work for equity, and we put our money in. So the legacy I'm trying to leave is to kind of redress the balance between human capital and financial capital, and have our company, myself and my son, and we've got other people that we're going to bring in, but to have an enduring company that does the recruiting business differently, with different financial incentives and different philosophical objectives. So he and I have been doing this for a decade. I will do it for some more years, largely at his discretion. But I'm hoping to offer that as a new form of business model in an old business. So there you go.
There you go. That's great. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you for making the time for me today. Thank you for sharing your story with the Canisius community. And I look forward to hearing about your adventures down the road. Thanks a lot, Phil.
It was great. Lovely. Thank you for your time. And I hope, Andy, I hope people find this of some use.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye now.